Hi, I'm Doug Bamford, and this is a video about net zero and whether there's any valid excuses not to be net zero, whether that's for an individual or for the country as a whole. And I'm recording this on the weekend after the hurricane in the Caribbean, Hurricane Melissa. At the moment, there's been, I think, thirty deaths announced in Jamaica and 50 deaths, including other countries as well, and that number will increase. But as well as the deaths, there's just been a huge amount of disruption and destruction of property and people's loss of livelihoods, and it's going to take a huge amount for those people to recover from this storm. And it's a storm that it seems very likely was made as bad as it was by climate change. There's been storms in the past, and there've been floods in the past, and all this sort of thing. It's true. But the thing about climate change is it's increasing the amount of energy in the climate system. And what it means is that what was once a really rare event, in some cases like these tropical storms, they'll be more common. So, and similarly, if you think about floods that maybe happened once every 100 years, suddenly they start to happen every 5 or 10 years. That could be a very big difference. And we've got the situation now in the UK where there are properties that are struggling to get insurance and probably will have to be abandoned because they're in areas that are now flooding so frequently that no insurer would want to provide insurance for that property. So there are whole towns that are now looking like they're going to have to, be abandoned. People who will have invested heavily in those properties are going to lose all of that investment. So there's the loss of life involved. There's the loss of property and livelihoods, the loss of agricultural product, that we all rely on food coming in and all these sorts of things. So you've got the tropical storms, obviously, those are big events we can see, but also all the flooding that just happens regularly around the world. It's starting to happen in places that our infrastructure wasn't built for that sort of flooding and our agriculture, but certainly also the natural ecosystems were also developed in a different climate now. We're getting to such a different climate that the natural systems just aren't going to be able to cope with this and they will start to break down. And those natural systems are obviously feeding into other processes. It's all a big interconnected system. And so once some ecosystems in some places start to fail, that will cascade and have impacts on other ecosystems. And eventually that's going to have further effects on human production. So this is a picture of a flooded valley here. And we've also had lots of wildfires. The forests have developed in a certain kind of climate, and then they can't cope with the dryness and the differences in, seasonal impacts and so on from the new climate we're finding ourselves in. And so there's a lot more burning going on, and there's been major fires in Canada and California and all around the world. The vegetation just isn't used to this kind of climate that we're finding ourselves in. And these kinds of impacts are going to get worse the more that climate change happens, the more that global warming occurs. So these things, this is just the start, basically. It wasn't too different for the first degree or so. We're now getting up to 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 degrees. We're on track for maybe 2.6, 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. That's the kind of point at which major ice sheets are melting and there's no way to things back to how they were. So we're causing, as humanity, these massive impacts on the world, and it's going to affect other humans, obviously. So yeah, I was planning this video for quite a while, and then I suddenly thought, well, actually, let's personalize it. Let's make this personal about one of those future victims of climate change. So if you're polluting now, then your emissions could harm someone in the future? And what if you were actually face to face with that person? So I think we should imagine like a dialogue, like this person, they accost you, they come up to you and they say, well, look what's happened. I've I've been seriously impacted by an event that only occurred because of climate change. So maybe, they were living in a valley and their house was washed away by a flood. Or maybe, they've lost their business or something like that, or their farm, or they've lost their pets, or maybe even they've lost family members. Maybe their spouse or their child were killed by an event that was due to climate change, essentially. So, what I think it would be best to do is instead of talking in this kind of abstract way, let's personalize this. And let's say it's a victim of climate change that comes up to you and says, you know, this has happened to me, and they're talking to you about it. And so, I want you to picture a victim, and it could be maybe someone who suffered from one of those recent disasters that I mentioned, someone in Jamaica or something like that. Or maybe it's someone who's a child now who's going to suffer from this kind of disaster in the future. They're going to have their house burnt down by a wildfire. Maybe it could be your child, your grandchild. They are going to have to face some sort of cost or major impact as a result of climate change. And then they come up to you, Greta Thunberg is maybe the person you think about doing this, like representing that younger generation and saying, how dare you cause this to us? Cause us to face these things in the future. And maybe you prefer to imagine someone who hasn't even been born yet. But yeah, whichever one it is, just think about that person. They come up to you in 1 year, in 5 years, in 20 years, and they say to you, look, I've suffered from this. What do you have to say about that? What would be a satisfactory response to this victim? And here's one response I think you could give. Um, and so you might say, or I might say, look, absolutely, it's really terrible that, you know, you've suffered from this and that there are so many people in the world who just don't care that they're contributing to this with their emissions and that they're causing your suffering or that they caused it. And for my part, personally, ever since I discovered about climate change and how serious it was, I've been aiming to achieve net zero emissions. So I've been trying to limit my own impact and I've been trying to offset whatever I couldn't easily reduce myself. So that's one response. And some people might say that's not an adequate response. It's saying, well, I'm going to try and offset, and then all the harm I cause, maybe the offsets will reduce some other harm, so it all evens out. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video in the future. But let's consider some possible excuses that someone might have that means that they don't have to do that. It's not necessary for them to say, look, I've been trying to be at net zero. So, what other excuses does someone have to be at net zero? So, one excuse might be, I didn't know. I didn't know that when I drove my car or took a flight or used, consumed certain products, that this was going to have this impact. So one version of this, no one told me about climate change. Or people were telling me that it wasn't a real thing, that it was made up, that it was a big hoax. And I think that in response to that kind of excuse, that it's pathetic. I think it's just no excuse whatsoever. Ignorance is an excuse against the law. And the picture I've got here is one that you can find online. There's video footage. And so this is the famous scientist and science communicator, Carl Sagan. And he was asked to come to the American Congress and Senate or something like that in 1985. And you can watch his explanation. And I think it's actually about the best explanation I've ever seen of climate change that doesn't use kind of graphics and things like that. There's very good videos out there which use graphics and things, but he just explains it using his words really well. And I think that just stands up about how to explain climate science and climate change. There are these gases that are invisible to us as humans, that when they're in the atmosphere, they essentially stop heat from getting out of the atmosphere. radiation that we also can't see that rises up from the Earth and goes out into space. These gases stop that from happening. That's the process. And it's been sort of accepted for well over 100 years. The exact details were only really worked out in the sort of late 60s and 70s. And then it started to filter down to politics in the 1980s. And it was, pretty much settled science by the mid 1980s. In the late 1980s, it got more coverage. And then what happened in the 1990s was there was just this massive campaign to undermine what the scientists were saying and trying to find any scientist who would say they disagreed and then amplifying that scientist, even if, to be honest, they just had a political reason, a financial reason, or something like that to cast doubt. Well, they just couldn't accept the truth, and so they were willing to put their name forward as someone with some sort of credential to say, I don't think this is right, this climate science. Let's face it, at this point, climate science is just the most studied and scrutinized area of science. And of course it is because, fossil fuel companies are worth billions. That's on the basis that they can dig stuff out of the ground, burn it, and the carbon goes into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, or maybe it doesn't even get burned and it just gets released as methane. This is a major issue, right? We'd all love it if somehow this wasn't true and we weren't causing all these problems with our activities. So, yeah, I've said Carl Sagan explained this in 1985, and we just don't have any legitimate reason at this point to doubt climate scientists. Now, if you kind of engage with these arguments, you'll see that there's just loads of different arguments from the sort of climate denialist kind of community. And one I've come across recently is just to say, well, this is kind of bad science, and there's just no way of knowing what will happen. It's too complicated. The climate is too complicated to predict what will happen. And I think that if you want to take that line of argument, then your conclusion is just you have no idea what your emissions are going to do. Maybe it will be much worse than the climate scientists are predicting. Or maybe it will be much better, right? They're just doing the best job they can to try and work it out. If you're going to say you have no idea, then it could be worse. There's no reason to think that magically everything is going to be okay if, climate science isn't perfect, something like that. So I don't think that doubt is a viable response. And we've got the receipts about what's been going on. It took scientists a long time to work out the way that their words were being manipulated and these sorts of things. But the receipts are there now. We know what was going on. We've seen through it. We can move on to actually doing something about this issue rather than having our time wasted with this. So I think if your excuse to the victim is to say, I didn't know, then I think that they can say, what do you mean you didn't know? It was everyone was talking about it. All the evidence was there. You could just go to a library or look online and find out about this. It's very well documented. Ignorance is no excuse, essentially. So I don't have any time for this. I think you just have to sort of make sure you have good judgment about who you listen to, who's a reliable person on this, and not just listen to the person who tells you what you want to hear. So I don't think they'll have any time for that, I'm afraid. Now, the second excuse might be to say, well, hang on a minute, loads of people have been causing these emissions. I'm just one little person. Maybe my emissions had nothing to do with the disaster that's befallen you. Those are two, completely separate things. So, and in general, you might say, well, once you've caused your emissions, they go up into the atmosphere. You have no idea what happens to them, but neither does anyone else. No one else can say, oh, that flight you took in 2012, that has caused this particular storm on this particular date. No, the emissions just go up in the atmosphere and they all spread around. And so you could try and claim, well, yeah, okay, climate change is causing all these harms, but my emissions went up in the atmosphere and they didn't cause any harm. Or maybe they went into the sea and didn't cause any harm, as the sea has absorbed some of the CO2. I think that ignores the fact that actually it going in the sea is impacting on the sea, and that's a bad thing. That's quite serious. If we're acidifying the sea, that's affecting all the life that goes on in the sea, and all the fishing and all the things that we get from the sea and everything like that. But you know, you could try and make this excuse. My excuse is somehow my emissions were benign. So what might the response be, do you think, from the climate victim to this person? And I think it's pretty basic, isn't it? How could you know that your emissions are going to be benign? You know about climate change. You know this is happening. So this always makes me think of the film Doubt. I don't know how many people have seen it, but it's from about 15 or 20 years ago. And one bit in that film is it's about a priest and a nun, but he gives a sermon, and there's this story about a gossip and an old priest. who- She confesses to being engaging in gossip, and the old priest makes this woman go up to the top of her building and cut open a pillow and let the feathers fall all around the place. And the woman does that. And then she goes back to the priest and says, "Okay, I did the thing you asked." And the priest goes to say, "Okay, now go and collect up all the feathers." And the woman says, "How can I do this? All the feathers have gone everywhere." And the powerful sermon is to say, "Well, that's like gossip, isn't it? You spread around this pollution of gossip, and you can't control how out of control it gets and the impacts that it'll have further down the line." And I think it's just the same with emissions, right? Your pollution. You can't control where it goes. You can hope that it doesn't do any harm, but you're causing this pollution. I don't think this is a valid excuse at all to say, well, I've done this thing, maybe it'll all work out fine. It's pretty poor, I think. So, okay, a third excuse. This one's starting to look a bit more like a valid excuse, right? You might live in a country which is set up in such a way that you find it really hard to be at net zero, right? So you might say, well, the infrastructure in my country doesn't allow me to reduce my sort of carbon footprint, is one term for it. And so I'm thinking, particularly if you're in a place where car culture really dominates and you need a car to get around. There's no pavements or sidewalks, as they would call it in the States. You can't walk, you can't safely cycle. You'll just get, killed if you try cycling around because everything's set up for cars. So you have to have a car, and then you have to use it to get to work and to get around, to do your shopping and to live your whole life. You have to have a car that is polluting and so on. And maybe there's other things as well, right? Your whole society is set up around burning fossil fuels. Maybe if you try and reduce your car usage or you get an electric car or something like that, well, it's just going to be powered by coal, and so it's not completely clean, even if you do that. The responses to this, well, maybe I should get you to think about what the victim would say in response, but I think they would say, well, okay, well, what did you do to actually challenge that? Did you try and engage in politics to select new local officials who would try and make it easier for you to bike around or to just really do things to achieve something like sustainable urban development? So you could do something about that, and then maybe that could, you know, give you your excuse here, and you could say, well, okay, it wasn't possible for me, but I did all I could to try to change the system to make it possible for people to be at net zero. So maybe they would be happy with that response. I don't know if they would though, because probably if you're in a country with massive car culture, it's quite a rich country. So then the question is, well, but why didn't you just offset your emissions? So I'll come back to that because the fourth excuse is to say, well, I just couldn't afford not to pollute, right? Maybe because of the country I was living in and my situation, you know, achieving net zero is expensive for me. And I think in a way that's fair enough, right? You would say, well, you don't have a moral duty to do something that it's impossible for you to do, right? And if your worry about climate change is that it's going to sort of ruin someone's life, there's no duty for you to ruin your life to not ruin the life of someone else. Some people might say that there is, there is that kind of duty, but I don't think that quite works. If you're worried about people losing their livelihood as a result of net zero, then you shouldn't have to lose your livelihood of concern for net zero as well. So I think this is a valid excuse in a sense. If you're going to say, look, I need to get to my work or I need to get to school or something like that, and there's just no way I can afford to take an alternative rather than the polluting one. So, it's really expensive for me if I was going to invest in something like an electric vehicle or other equipment that would reduce my personal emissions. So I'm in this, difficult position. I'm not one of these rich people that could do something about this. So what would the person's response be to this if you said this to them? And I personally would be quite sympathetic to someone who made this kind of argument if it was their genuine situation. So I would tend to agree that people who have no alternative and they can't afford to offset their emissions have no duty to do so. However, that really applies to people in the poorest countries in the world, right? I don't think it applies to anyone, hardly, in rich countries. Maybe very few people who really do live on the breadline. But at the moment, at least, and this might change quite substantially in the near future, carbon offsets are very cheap. So I just looked up the prices. £70 would cover the price of offsetting for a year for someone in the UK. Now, I think that they're really cheap to do, partly because solar power is so cheap. So it's quite cheap. You just pay for some solar panels, and that could offset a huge amount of emissions. So once those cheap and easy kind of options start to get used up, and they would get used up very quickly if everyone did this, right? But hardly anyone does this, I don't believe. So this is why it's so cheap. But that price is going to increase a lot as time goes on. As we've used up all of the cheap offsetting options, the price is going to rise. And then we need to start thinking about investing in those alternatives, although some of those offsets will be kind of like investments in the alternatives. And now I'll come on to another excuse, which might seem like a good one. And this is the excuse of others aren't doing anything. And you get this so often. And it's this kind of like, other people aren't doing it, so why should I? And so one version of this that you'll see a lot online is, well, what about China? Or what about India? They're burning coal, something like that. And I think that this really appeals to people because, in general, we're really attuned to concerns about fairness and about free riding, right? And this thought that, well, I don't want to be the sucker, right? I don't want to be the person who pays their taxes when no one else is paying their taxes. And that's why the government has to make sure everyone pays their taxes, right? Because if it was voluntary, then some people wouldn't, and then everyone else would say, well, they're not, so I'm not going to do it. So that's why probably it needs to be governments that take the lead for lots of reasons, actually, on this net zero issue. But, maybe the victim could be talking to a government here. Let's imagine they're talking to an individual. But in general, there is this concern. Where you get free riders, that undermines institutions. And I think in response, I would say this is usually a bad faith argument. This is people who want an excuse to pollute, and they're just trying to come up with an excuse for doing it. So I don't have much time for this. I don't think that the victim of climate change would have much time for this if you try to make this excuse to them. They're going to say, well, yeah, but I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to you. And I'm happy to talk to them as well. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for you. If you say, well, everyone else was murdering, so why shouldn't I go around murdering everyone? I mean, that just doesn't wash, does it? So, yeah, very poor argument. But also, there's loads of people out there that are doing loads of things to reduce their emissions. And that includes countries like China and India, actually. They are, in some areas, introducing things like solar panels faster than other countries that are wealthier than them. And those are countries that are really going to suffer badly from climate change. China will suffer terrible flooding as a result of climate change, so they're taking it very seriously. India is already suffering from really bad heat waves, and those are going to get worse with climate change. So these are two countries that really want to do something about it, and they are doing something about it. And I think it's very bad faith kind of argument that people are making. And in general, I just don't think it's a valid excuse. And so, and this just makes me think of toddler. Essentially, it's the kind of toddler who says, "Wah, wah, wah, my brother isn't doing this chore. Why do I have to do this chore?" And, we're all like that as kids. That's fair enough. But this person, this victim of climate change, isn't talking to a kid here. They're talking to you. So grow up, I think, would be their response if someone tries to make this kind of excuse. All you have to do is buy some carbon offsets, work out your carbon emissions, buy some offsets for them. So the summary then, I do think some people have a genuine excuse. And so I've found a picture here of some people who are looking for scrap in dump in, I think this is India. I don't think these people have a duty to be a net zero. I think the people in the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, they hardly pollute anything, but they don't have a duty to offset their emissions. They are struggling to survive. So they have a good excuse. If the victim of climate change goes up to them and they say, "Look, every day I am struggling to get enough food to live. That is my one thing that I aim to do every day." That's fair enough that they're causing a tiny amount of emissions that they're not offsetting. So if they really have no alternative to pollute in order to survive, and they can't afford the offsets, then that's fine. But I think morally speaking, everyone else should be looking to achieve net zero already. And I kind of said why really it needs to be the government that does this, because if it's voluntary, then lots of people won't do it. It won't be effective. It's going to be much more effective if the government takes the lead on this thing, and that will really help with this free rider issue. Obviously, we've now seen the switch. It's not about free riding individuals anymore, it's now about free riding countries. But nevertheless, as individuals, we can say, look, our government's not doing enough. So, look, I'm going to step in, step up, and voluntarily offset my emissions in the meantime until the government is going to be doing the things it should be doing. And so, yeah, what I've done is I try to think about some of the common excuses that people give for not engaging in climate action and supporting it and that sort of thing, and considered whether they would be acceptable excuses to give to a victim of climate change. So I would say those were the main ones that occurred to me, but maybe I've missed some. So if you have some suggestions for other good excuses, then feel free to put them in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear them. And, what would the response then be to the climate victim? Would you say something different to that text that I gave you earlier on? Is there a better response or a different response? Share your thoughts on this. I think this is a huge issue for humanity and planet Earth. And I think we all have to look ourselves in the mirror each day and say, have I done the right things here? Or did I fail to do the right things here? So, yeah, I look forward to getting comments on this, seeing what you think about it.